Last week I recorded a short talk from Acts chapter 16 for New Craig Community Church in Motherwell, and this is the text of that talk. From Troas we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we travelled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshipper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. Chapter 16 in Acts then goes on to talk about the jailer and his conversion after Paul and Silas are put into prison there. And then at the end of the chapter, in verse 40, we meet Lydia once again. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. Then they left. And the Lord will bless the reading of his word to us. So what we've just read is Luke's account of Paul's first trip to Europe. And as Luke explores the way in which the good news has gone out and the way that it goes right the way to, as he says at the beginning, the ends of the earth, this is the first time that the good news has reached the continent of Europe. And Paul lands on the coast at Neapolis and heads inland to the town of Philippi. Now this is in modern-day Greece. And Philippi, as we read, is a Roman city, and it is the leading city of that district of Macedonia. So it's quite an important central place. One of the other things that we learn from this is that there were not many Jews in the town. Now we know that because there is no synagogue. For Paul to find those people who are worshippers of God, he has to actually find a place of prayer which is down by the river. Now it seems that Paul expected this to be the case. So it seems that when no synagogue is available, no building as it were in the town, it was fairly common for those who worship God to meet somewhere outside. Now Paul's normal way of operating when he goes into a new place is to visit the synagogue first and to share the good news of Jesus with the Jews who are there. If and when they reject that story, then Paul goes broader, goes outside of that synagogue and talks to people outside. On this occasion there is no synagogue, so Paul immediately goes outside the gates to the local river. Now that's a nice little eyewitness part to the story, a nice little touch. But I think the geographical location, the physical location, is not just to give us an idea that this is the sort of thing that happened, that Paul knew this would be the case. I think there's something that's going on underneath this. I think there are some very real clues to a deeper message, if you like, that sort of just lies below the surface of what is going on. It gives us a clue as to what is happening in the coming of the good news of Jesus, when the good news comes to a new city and new people encounter the reality of who Jesus is. See, I think what Luke is exploring here is how outsiders, those who in some way are excluded, are brought into the kingdom of God through the person of Jesus. And so on the first Sabbath that Paul is in Philippi, he goes outside of the city in order to find those people who worship God. And he does find a group of them down by the river. What seems to be the case about this group is that it is exclusively made up of women. And one of those women is Lydia. So the first thing that we need to notice in terms of Lydia and the way in which she is excluded is that she is a woman. Women are simply not a central part of society. If we think of a synagogue for the moment, and we mentioned just a minute or two ago that there obviously wasn't a synagogue in Philippi, for a synagogue to be there and to be able to hold a time of prayer, there needed to be at least 10 men. Not 10 people, not 1 man and 9 women, or even 9 men and 1 woman, but 10 men. So the fact that this seems to be a gathering of only women, and that there is no synagogue in the town, suggests there are not enough Jewish men in the town to form a quorum for the synagogue. And so Paul speaks to the group of women who are there. And so the first person to become a follower of Jesus in Europe is a woman. And I suggest that says something about God. And so, having realised that Lydia is a woman, we learn something else as well. We learn that she is from Thyatira. Now, that may not immediately leap out at us, but what it tells us is that she isn't, in fact, European. She's Asian. She's from what is now Turkey. And Thyatira, as you'll know, is one of those churches which is addressed in the book of Revelation. So in terms of society, in societal terms, Lydia is an outsider because she is an immigrant. She's not a native of Philippi or indeed even of Macedonia. Thyatira, where she comes from, was known for its cloth. It was a centre of the trade in cloth. And so it may well be that Lydia is importing cloth from her hometown and that she's come across to what now is Greece from what now is Turkey to make her way economically. The first person to become a follower of Jesus in Europe is an Asian immigrant. That tells us something about God. So Lydia is excluded because she is a woman. She's excluded because she is an immigrant. But she's also excluded because she is a Gentile. She isn't a Jew. She's described as a worshipper of God in verse 14. Now that's the description that Luke gives to Gentiles who have, in one way or another, embraced the Jewish faith. You might think of Cornelius in a similar way. But they are, of course, not Jews. Lydia is not a Jew. And because of that, she is an outsider. She is outside, a stranger to the promise of God. But she is the first person who is shown responding to the good news of Jesus. The first person to become a follower of Jesus in Europe is a Gentile. Now that tells us something about God. In 3 ways then, Lydia is outside. In 3 ways she is shown as being excluded. Her physical situation outside of the city gate mirrors her situation in terms of her sex, her nationality, and her spiritual position. 3 reasons why she is excluded. I think it's interesting that those 3 particular exclusions, those same ideas, are mentioned by Paul elsewhere. They're mentioned by him in his letter to the churches of Galatia, where in chapter 3 in verse 28 he says this: "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Now, those barriers were there in Paul's time, and in many ways they remain even in our time. But those barriers mean nothing in terms of the gospel. Those divisions do not have a place within the family of God. And so it doesn't matter whether you're Jew or Gentile. There are no spiritual barriers. It doesn't matter whether you're a slave or free, whether you are a European, a Philippian, or an Asian. There are no societal, no national barriers. And it doesn't matter whether you're male or female. There are no barriers of sex or gender. Because the good news, instead of being something which excludes people, is actually something which embraces people, which brings people in, not pushes people away. And so Lydia, as this first person in Europe coming to faith, is excluded in these 3 ways. But she responds to the message. She actually accepts the story of who Jesus is and the reality of who Jesus is. And then she and her household are all baptized. And in all likelihood, they were baptized there and then in the river where they had just met, where they had just committed themselves to Christ. And so what happens after that? Well, verse 15 tells us that she invited us to her home. Well, a little aside here, I mentioned earlier that the statement about being outside by the river was a little bit of an eyewitness, gave a little bit of an eyewitness feel to the story. And this does as well, doesn't it? Because it clearly suggests that Luke himself was there for this occasion. That Luke himself was part of the group who went outside the gate and met Lydia. We are hearing from an eyewitness to the events. And Lydia's first action is one of hospitality and of generosity. And she does this directly in response to her conversion. And the really fascinating thing for me about that is that she recognises this herself right from the very start. If you consider me to be a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. Coming to faith in Jesus, following Jesus, becoming a disciple has had an immediate effect on her life. And in her case, it is this. It's about generosity. It's about hospitality. Now notice what doesn't happen. Paul does not tell her to leave her work. He doesn't tell her to sell up. He doesn't tell her that actually a man should be running her business, not her, but maybe I shouldn't say that. However, Lydia recognises that now, having come to Christ, everything that she has must be put to the service of Jesus, to the spread of the good news. Now, we've seen this throughout the book of Acts. Luke has continually reminded us of this, but he lays the groundwork for it right back at the very beginning. So in chapter 2, we're told that everyone had everything in common. And in chapter 4, we read a similar thing. Now, Luke doesn't keep on repeating exactly the same thing over and over again, because he expects us to see this commonality, this fellowship of what we have, as actually being the norm for the church. And Lydia is simply working out what is the norm for God's people. Lydia doesn't even seem to have to be taught this. She willingly and voluntarily makes her home, her possessions, available to the good news. Once Paul and Silas have been released from prison, they go back to Lydia's house. So not for the first time, but that's where they go. Because Lydia's house has already, even in this what seems to be quite a short period of time, has become the place that the new believers are meeting in. So it's not just Lydia and her household now. There appears to be a group of men and women who have come to know Christ, and they are meeting in her house. As a businesswoman, she is able in a very real way to serve the cause of the gospel. From being an outsider, excluded from the promises of God, she has embraced the good news and been embraced by the one who is that good news, been embraced by Jesus. And so, having been brought into the promises of God, she further embraces that calling, her calling to serve the cause of Jesus. And so she willingly, generously places what God has given her at the disposal of Paul and the others. The good news is good news for the outsider, for all who feel a little bit excluded in one way or another. And as Christians, we need to ensure that, like Paul, we bring the good news to the outsider. We bring the good news without favour. We bring that good news without discrimination. Because in the church there must be no barriers. Because Jesus has broken them down. But also, like Lydia, we must be ready to voluntarily and gladly place all that we have, all that we are, our gifts, our possessions, our intelligence, our income, at the disposal of the good news. Not because we have to, but because, like Lydia, we recognise that this generosity flows naturally from the reality of our salvation.